So title of this is Sex, Gender and Oppression. And I thought that rather than just sort of giving the same speech that I feel like I've given lots of times before, I thought I'd try and come at it from a slightly different direction and hopefully kind of stimulate some discussion and some questions and so on. So we know, if you've heard me and others, Lindsay and so on, speak on this, you know that oppression is a result of class. You only get oppression in class societies. If you don't have class, you don't have oppression. So I'm going to kind of circle back to that. But the question I want to start with is something slightly different, which is, okay, so given that, okay, we know that you get oppression in class societies, why is it women who are oppressed? Why isn't it the other way around? Why don't you get some societies where in a class society it's women who are on top and it's men who are oppressed? So, I mean, obviously there's a reason for this, but I think it's kind of useful to look at it that way around, because what I'm going to try and do, I think, is unpick the relationship of women's biology to oppression. Because this is something that's often, I think it's often people get wrong. It's of either direction, that either they see oppression as being completely inherent to women's biology and therefore inevitable to, if you have women's biology, then you are oppressible in a sense, or as wanting to see oppression as completely free floating and not relating to women's reproductive function, women's sex at all, so that it can be, so that oppression works on people who just behave in a feminine manner rather than people who have women's biology. And neither of these polls are correct. And I hope that kind of looking at it, well, as a question of why are women oppressed will kind of help us tease out why they're not correct. So the assumption that if anyone's going to be oppressed, then it's going to be women. It's kind of this. I mean, this is an idea with a very, very long history. And if you went back to 19th century, 18th century views and so on, it's really comes down to, well, women are just so oppressible. And the reasons why they're oppressible would differ according to who you were listening to, but this is where all the kind of the old-fashioned, well, women just have smaller brains, and women just can't cope with advanced thought, and therefore they need men to lead them, that sort of thing. It's kind of this sense that women are just a bit rubbish, really, and therefore that's why men dominate. And obviously we don't we don't believe any of that anymore, clearly. And interestingly, of course, women don't have smaller brains than men. They do, absolutely, but relative to body size, they don't. And the other point on that to note is that if we're going to kind of judge people's worth by brain size, well, actually, Neanderthals actually had bigger brains than Homo sapiens. So obviously, if we're going to go by brain size, we would have to kind of give up our crown as the most intelligent hominid. So clearly, we're not going to do that. But of course, I'm not going to spend very much time talking about those incredibly regressive ideas about what women are like. But there are some more modern arguments, which I think do need a little bit more time to dispose of, which are arguments around division of labor. So this is basically this. So if you read books about human evolution and prehistoric human societies and so on, you will come across these attempts to kind of model what human society before class, before written history and so on might have been like through looking at kind of modern hunter-gatherer societies. This is a technique that is used a lot in anthropology, particularly. And when they're looking at division of labor, the argument is very often that somehow women's biology kind of fits them for certain jobs, or indeed sometimes that women's sort of innate preferences fits them for certain jobs in human society, which meant that when you have class society that comes along, sometimes these anthropologists don't do that bit because they don't see class, but when you get more complex societies and you start getting oppression, that means that women are automatically oppressed. And the problem with these arguments is that I think that I mean, they can be they're quite seductive in a sense, and I'll talk about why in a sec. But the problem is, of course, is that you are then really saying you're back to that point that women are kind of inherently oppressible, that there's something built in about women's either women's biology or women's preferences that means that if anyone's going to be doing the oppressing, it's going to be men oppressing women rather than the other way around. So it's a profoundly ahistorical way of understanding the roots of women's oppression. But like I said, I think it's basically, I realize I haven't quite said what the division of labor is. So the basic assumption is that women end up doing the low status stuff into a hunter-gatherer society. So they do the gathering bit, and men do the high status stuff like hunting. And this results in many societies that have been looked at with women doing most of the work. So I came across recently, this is a quotation about division of labour in the Hadza society, who are hunter-gatherer people in, I think, Tanzania, but I might be getting that wrong. It's sub-Saharan Africa anyway. So this is what the anthropologists found, that women toiled all day in the hot sun digging tubers, then came home and hammered baobab seeds until dark, while the men sat in the shade talking, smoking and fiddling with their arrows. So this is this kind of, it's seductive, I think, because it's immediately familiar. I mean, this reminds me not just the kind of, modern women's complaints about men not doing their share of the housework, but like say my grandmother, who grew up in a small South Welsh coal mining village, saying about how, all the women would be out scrubbing the step frantically because you were judged completely by how clean your step was, while all the men would be standing around on the bridge in the village gossiping and smoking. So it's kind of, immediately you read that quotation, you think, oh, this must be something about the human condition because we recognize it. But that's kind of a trap, really. And so it's worth thinking a bit about why we think that kind of is the human condition. So the argument, of course, is that women end up doing most of the work and the gathering work because they're doing childcare and therefore they need to be closer to home and so on. And there's all sorts of other arguments about, well, women can't go hunting because it's too dangerous and therefore you don't risk your reproductive resources in that way. So the young men are more expendable, so therefore they go and do the hunting, and controlling the meat supply is very important. So therefore men end up being the dominant group, even in the groups that are otherwise egalitarian. And these arguments kind of sound very kind of, yep, obviously that would be the case. So a lot of anthropologists, I think, just kind of accept this as a given, that this is, because women have babies, this is how things this is how things will always be. But it doesn't, when you think about it, actually, it doesn't really add up. I mean, to be honest, if you were going to have the maximum kind of attention for childcare, really you'd have men do all the work and women just look after the babies and not do anything else. This kind of model where women do all the work isn't actually the best model for best attention to reproduction. And the whole kind of idea that man is the mighty hunter and goes out hunting the mammoth and so on, it doesn't really bear an awful lot of resemblance to what we think the reality of people's lives was in prehistory and the Paleolithic and so on. There's most of the protein that we find evidence that people are getting is sort of fish and rabbits and things like that. So, hunting rabbits is not particularly dangerous. There's not really any reason why you have to have a division of labor that women can't do this. So I think that there's the idea that there's this kind of division of labor that comes out of women's biology, and therefore this is why women do low status work. It kind of doesn't hold up in many ways. And there's also a problem here that we're assuming that you can look at groups like the Hadza, say, and say, okay, well, they are exactly what all humans would have been like in prehistory. I mean, that's a very dangerous assumption that the anthropologists do all the time, that they kind of treat these groups as if they're kind of a time machine. And that really doesn't take into account the effect of colonialism, the effect of settled society around these groups. They're very marginal. And the Hadza are kind of about 1,000 people, I think, living in what is, after all, a modern state within the capitalist mode of production. So the idea that we can kind of see these people as being this kind of pristine non-class society is not really very accurate. I mean, they obviously work quite hard to retain kind of internal group relationships that are egalitarian, but the idea that they kind of represent not pre-class human society, and therefore we can say, well, this is what humans would have been like before anyone had class, is clearly not tenable. And we do have some suggestions that actually possibly pre-class there might not have been these very strict divisions of labor that we see in modern hunter-gatherer societies. There's some evidence from cattle Hayek, which I talk about a lot because cattle Hayek is really cool, which is quite a sophisticated city in the ancient Anatolia. It's quite a big settlement, but it isn't a class society. We can tell that it's not. It's obviously an egalitarian society, even though it's quite a developed one. And there we have some archaeological evidence of kind of like men doing childcare and things like that. So it's kind of suggestive that actually you get divisions of labor maybe under the influence of class society. So maybe none of this kind of, well, women have to stay close to the cave to look after the babies. Maybe none of this is accurate. So possibly the whole idea that you have that division of labor comes out of women's biology is possibly looking at things the wrong way around. It's possible that actually the division of labor is imposed by class society. And if you don't have class at all, maybe you have a much freer who does what. So we can't sort of think that, well, women's oppression comes out of women's need to stay at home and dig up tubers while the men sit and fiddle with their arrows. This isn't a kind of something that's inherent to women's biology. But obviously that doesn't mean that we can just say, oh, well, it's all just down to preference. By saying that, okay, I don't think that women's oppression comes out of division of labor isn't the same as saying that, well, women's oppression is just because it's just random. It clearly is related to women's biology in an important way. But I think how we understand it is that we have to understand how oppression developed as something that's historical. So the arguments around the division of labor are really talking about kind of biology as destiny, and it's really taking out class as far as possible and say, well, once you get any class, then women are just oppressible. So it's not really very much further along than saying that women have smaller brains and therefore they're oppressed. So what we need to do really is, as always in these debates, go back to Engels and how Engels understood what happened in the development of class society. And of course, to paraphrase Engels' argument in a very short space of time, what he saw is that once you get private property, and so you have the development of a class society, so you have some people who have more property than others and so on. The only way that men who have amassed this property can pass it on to their children is to control the women who they're having those children with, because otherwise they don't know who their children are. So therefore you have this built-in need to control women. And of course, and the point is, of course, that this doesn't work the other way around. Women know who their children are. So if you are a matriarch and you want to pass on your property, you don't have to have any additional control. You can just do that. So this only applies to men. And it's important, I think, to understand this as a historical process. So if you think about these kind of early class societies where you've got some people who are beginning to control more and more property, and they're beginning to use that to employ others and to make the stockade around their compound, which then becomes the palace, and start taxing other people and so on. So what this is, of course, is not all men oppressing all women. This is a small group of men oppressing exploiting, I should say, everybody else. And so what you have to think about is in these very early class societies, why does that stick? I mean, we tend to think, because we know that in the end, class society became completely dominant, and it's completely covered every human society in the world in the end. Why did it work at all? Why did people put up with it? I mean, we know from evidence, again, from my favorite places in ancient Anatolia, that actually, so this was very contested. We have the example of what I think is probably the first successful revolution in 7000 BC, something like that. So, it's not that as soon as anyone invents class, everyone's just like, oh yeah, that's fine, we'll just have a class society now. This is all very contested stuff. So what you have to think about is why was it that the patriarchal version of class society became stable? And what I think women's oppression does in this context is that it gives men who aren't part of the ruling class a little bit of interest in the system. Because if you think about it, what women's oppression does is, for men who aren't actually part of the exploiting class, they're being exploited themselves by this small group of rich men who've got all the property and the power and so on. But what the opportunity to oppress women does is it gives them an interest, an ability to control the reproduction of labor in their own household. So it's effectively saying to them, okay, well, you haven't got you know, you're being exploited, you're no longer a member of an egalitarian society, you've got to do what this guy who now says he's the king tells you, and you've got to pay him the resources that he says that you owe him, and so on. But you can rule your own household, and you can rule the children that are being produced in the household, and you can control their labor and the contribution that they're making to the reproduction of labor in your own household. So you give non-ruling class men a bit of a stake in the system, a bit of a reason to say, oh yes, well actually, you know, I think our new king is doing a jolly fine job, and I don't think we should overthrow him and go back to our egalitarian society. And of course, you wouldn't get that the other way around. So, you know, in a matriarchal society, because there must surely have been some instances, if you have an egalitarian pre-class societies, it must surely have been some instances where it was a woman who started amassing property and saying, well, actually, I'm going to keep this now, and you guys are going to do what I say. But I think matriarchal societies wouldn't have had that extra reason for people who aren't part of the ruling class to knuckle under it, or knuckle under in the same way. Whereas what women's oppression does is it gives all men in those early class societies a bit of a stake in the system, a bit of a marginal interest, if you like, that this enables them to do their own bit of controlling the reproduction of labor. So I think that's what that's what women's oppression does for exploitation, and it's why it's not a separate form of you know, nastiness, if you like, that happens to be going along in parallel with exploitation. It's part of exploitation from the beginning. But you can see there that it does relate to women's biology. It relates to women's reproductive role. If it wasn't women who had the babies, then, I mean, obviously that's a nonsensical thing to say, but it's because it's women who have the babies that controlling them in that way gives that bit of control to lower class men, and therefore I think makes these societies rather more stable than the other way around would have been. So it's important to understand that it does relate to women's biology. It's not anything about, oh, well, it's oppression of people who choose to do a particular role in society or anything like that. It is biological. But what we have to understand is that it is nevertheless still a historical process. There is no sense in which this is just inevitable. And that, I think, is my main problem with the sort of the division of labor arguments, that they see effectively they are seeing women's oppression as if it is just inevitable. You know, as if this is always going to happen at some point, and it's always going to be women who are oppressed. And I don't think that we should see it in that way. This is something that happened historically, and once it did happen, it was very successful, and it spread from society to society. So this is why we now live in a world where there are no non-class societies. But it doesn't mean that there's something about women who are kind of oppressible. Well, the other thing that I wanted to, the point that I wanted to make here is that, because I think often it's when we're thinking therefore about, okay, well, that's the Stone Age, that's the Neolithic, let's move it forward to modern society. One of the things that I think is quite difficult to get our head around is that this works on women as a group, and it doesn't depend on what our decisions as individual women have been in relation to our biology. So, me saying that, okay, well, basically women's oppression does relate to women's biology insofar as women are the class that have the babies. That means that all women are oppressed for that reason, regardless of whether they as individuals have the babies or not. And I'm a childless woman, but I still suffer from women's oppression, even though I haven't actually reproduced myself. And I think that's important to understand, because otherwise we can slip into a way of kind of thinking, okay, well, it's about women's biology, but it's almost about your consumer decisions of what you do with your own body. And it's not that at all. This is oppression of women as a group. But of course, because this comes out of class society, what we also have to, of course, understand, and it's worth coming back to every time we talk about this, is that it is not all men against all women. Women's oppression exists as part of the exploitative society in which we live. And what that means is that working class women have more interests in common with working class men than they do with bourgeois women. So it is not the case that even though all women are oppressed on the basis of their sex, it's not the case that therefore all women have all interests in common despite their class interest. I always think that the class interest trumps everything else in that sense, and that actually in order to overthrow women's oppression, what you need is working class men and working class women working together, actually probably against bourgeois women, because it's not in their interest to change the system, because they gain more from the system of exploitation which oppression is buttressing. So I think that's kind of that's always where I end up here. I think it's really important, particularly now with debates about nature of sex and gender and so on, to be really clear about that relationship between oppression and biology. Because I think if we don't get that clear, it's very difficult to think about, well, how do we take on issues that women are facing now, including obviously things like sort of attacks on abortion, and a couple of really terrible sort of judicial decisions that we've seen recently of the woman who had the very late term abortions criminalized, and the very young woman who committed infanticide, and I saw has got like 12 years, which is absolutely appalling. And I think, you know, obviously we need to be standing up against these things, and I think we can't do that successfully if we're not doing that on the basis of a really clear understanding of how, you know, oppression relates to sex.